Okay, so now we're going to take a look at how to actually use objects in our methods. So that's going to include passing objects as arguments into methods or returning objects from methods. So keep in mind that objects are going to be passed by reference into methods. So we've seen a little bit about this before. We talked a little bit about things like the string class or dealing with arrays. In the following example, the rect parameter will hold the same reference as the box variable. So in this example that I'm showing right here, we've got our main method. Inside of that main method, we've got a rectangle object that we're calling box. So box would essentially be the name of the reference variable that holds a reference to our actual object. We then have a call to display rectangle. So this is going to be a method inside of that same class as the main method. And we're going to pass in our box, which means we're passing in the reference variable. So then when we go over to the display rectangle method, we're going to be passing that reference over to the rect parameter that's inside of display rectangle. So then whenever we use this inside of that method, we're actually going to be using the reference to that same object that the box variable references. So recall from the discussion about copying arrays that this copying of references can have some unintended consequences. This includes things like manipulating the data of the original reference box through the use of the copied reference, in this case rect. So similar to copying arrays, we would need to come up with some way to copy the objects themselves rather than the references to the objects. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is just show you a simple setup for display rectangle. We'll start off by just showing it printing the contents of our rectangles. I'll talk a little bit about these unintended consequences, and I'll leave it to you to think a little bit about how we're going to go about managing this copying process. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So to start off with, we'll come back over to our NetBeans project. So we've got our rectangle demo already. So we've got a fair bit of code in here, including all of these print statements that we include right here. And ideally, considering the fact that I'm constantly using these print statements to print out the length, width, and area for every one of my rectangles, it would be kind of nice to be able to reduce this down a little bit by just creating a method that does all of this printing for me. And then I can just call that method to just take care of all of that, rather than repeatedly doing this over and over again. There's a little bit too much duplicate code in my program. So let's come down here, outside of the main method, but still in our rectangle demo class. We'll go ahead and create another method right here. So we'll say public static void. So it's going to be void because it just does printing. It's not going to return anything. We'll call it display rectangle. And essentially what it's going to do is just display some information about that rectangle. So right here, we'll go ahead and create the parameter. So we'll say rectangle. Let's say for this particular version of the program, we'll just call the parameter rectangle, but in all lowercase. So unlike our class name, the rectangle name is going to have a lowercase r. And then right here, we'll go ahead and just put in these three print statements. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab these. Let's go ahead and copy them for now. So copy all those, paste them right there. And then within the scope of this method, I need to go ahead and change rect right here to rectangle. So go ahead and change it to match the name that we gave that parameter. And now that I've got all that, then what I can go ahead and do is, instead of doing all of these print statements, just go ahead and get rid of all that. We're going to replace that with a call to display rectangle. And for each one of these calls, we're going to go ahead and put in a different rectangle object, or the reference variable to a rectangle object. So we're going to put in rect for the first one. Let's go ahead and do box for the next one. Go ahead and do room for the next one. And then finally, we can go ahead and do square for that one that we added that has just one argument for its constructor. So that way then we can go ahead and do one for all four of the objects that we construct right here. And so then if we go ahead and run this, we can go ahead and print out all of that information. In addition, we also still have these two print statements. What I'll go ahead and do is just comment out those two lines. Just go ahead and save that. So that way then we can go ahead and see just the information we're getting from our display rectangle calls. So we'll go ahead and run this. And so now we've got quite a few different print statements. So we'll kind of lift this up a little bit. So one thing to note is that now when we do this, it's going to say the length of the rectangle is 1.0. So the first one's going to be the no args. It's just going to say 1.0 for all of them. Next one's going to be 15 and 5. It's going to be the length and width, and then 75 for the area. The third one, this is going to be for the room variable. It's going to be 16 and 14 for the length and width, 224 for the area. And then finally for our square, we used the constructor that takes just a single argument. So just took that 7 and applied that to both the length and width. So they're both going to be 7. And then its area is going to be 49, or 7 squared. Okay, so this is the general purpose of passing an object into some other method. But let's see what happens if we try to do this in a way that will manipulate or kind of change the contents of this first. So let's say right here, we go ahead and do something like rectangle.set length. Let's go ahead and set the length for all of these to 10. Go ahead and save that. So naturally, if we go ahead and run this, all of these outputs will be a little bit different because now the length is going to be 10 for every single thing that we pass in. So we run that, and you'll see that it has that effect inside of the display rectangle method. So we got 10 for the length there, and then 10 for this length right here, 10 for the length right there, and then 10 for the length right there. Of course, that also will impact the area for each one of them. So we'll go ahead and close this. But now let's go ahead and say we want to go ahead and just display that again right here. So let's go ahead and grab this one line right here. We'll go ahead and copy that. And let's go ahead and put it right here. We want to change this to just rect. So keep in mind that we're saying right here that we're going to do rectangle.setLength. So that's supposed to set the length of rectangle, which is this variable here that we're using only in the scope of display rectangle. But what happens if we come back over to our main method and we check the length of one of the rectangles that we made in the scope of the main method? So say this rect that we have right here. So in the scope of the main method, dealing with this rect variable, we initially go ahead and set its length and width using the noargs constructor to 1 for each of those. But we never actually change its length to 10. So if I go ahead and run this, let's say, go ahead and change this to say the length of the rect is, so that way we can go ahead and tell that this is corresponding to specifically the rect variable in the main method. We go ahead and run that. We see our very last print statement right here telling us that the length of the rect is 10.0. So even though I did not explicitly tell it to change the value for rect, because of the fact that this rectangle variable that I have in my method down here, because this references or kind of points to the same rectangle object that rect does, if I change that object using this variable, like I do right here, that's also going to affect it from the perspective of rect up here. So they're both going to see, or they're both going to observe the exact same changes that are being made to that object. So that's the problem we run into here. So if you were to do this for all 4 of these, you'll find that for rect, box, room, and square, all of these now have a length of 10 for their object. So of course, the thing that we want to think about is how do we go about fixing this problem? And one of the possible solutions for this is going to be to just copy the object before we actually start doing something with it. So a little bit later, we'll see how we can go about actually performing a copy of the object itself, rather than, in this case, essentially making a copy of the reference by having rectangle point to the same things that rect, box, room, and square happen to point to. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that a little bit later. The next thing we'll take a look at when it comes to objects with methods is going to be returning them from those methods. So classes can be specified as the return type of a method. This process has already been seen before with returning objects of the string class as well as arrays. So in this example, we're dealing with the bank account class. So we're going to say public static, and then bank account is going to be the return type, meaning that we need to return a bank account object. So in this instance, the one statement that we have in here is going to be to return a new bank account object with some balance being specified. So we can take a look at something kind of similar to that over here. So let's say that after setting up our display rectangle, let's go ahead and correct it so that we don't make this modification anymore. Save that, and we'll also go ahead and remove this extra print statement. And then underneath the display rectangle method, let's go ahead and create a, let's say, Getrectangle method. So we'll say public static, and this one's going to be rectangle because of the fact that it's going to return an object of the rectangle class, and then we'll say Getrectangle. And for this one, what we'll go ahead and do is just say return a new rectangle. We'll go ahead and use the noargs constructor to create this. And so then, if I come back up to the top here, let's say that instead of using this right here, we'll go ahead and use the Getrectangle method. Okay. So now the Getrectangle method, because of the fact that that returns a new rectangle object right here for me, that's just going to accomplish the same behavior as what I had before in line 7 right here. So if I go ahead and run this program, it's just going to do the exact same thing that it did before. It's just that how it goes about constructing that rectangle is going to be a little bit different. So we can go ahead and run this, and you'll see if you look through the outputs for this, primarily these first 3 outputs, that the first rectangle object that I'm constructing is still going to come out exactly the same way. And then if you want to go ahead and make this a little bit more interesting, you could also go ahead and specify some parameters for it, and then just use those as the dimensions of the rectangle. So maybe you could go ahead and do something like double length and double width, and then just use those right inside of this. So you can say like length and width. So basically then you're just kind of replicating the behavior of the different types of constructors for the rectangle class. You're just doing it with a method that will return the entire newly constructed rectangle object, which is not terribly different from what the constructor method right over here, if you're dealing with any one of these constructor methods, what these are meant to do. But in this case, if we go ahead and change it like that, let's say to continue to get the exact same behavior, we'll just give it 1, 1. So that way then when we go ahead and run this and print it to the console, we still get the exact same values that we had before. We're just explicitly stating that we want it to have a length and width of 1. Alright, so at this point this is going to wrap up everything for using objects with methods. So we saw how to pass them into methods or return them from methods. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how to start implementing one of the first additional methods that we can use with our classes, which is going to be the toString method.